Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for coming here today on this extraordinarily hot and goose-filled day. Thank you for making the journey out here. We are absolutely delighted to have Preti Taneja, who is going to be here in conversation with our Juliana Mensah. Just to let you know, there's no fire drills scheduled today, so if you do hear the alarm go off, the emergency exits are... Okay, so in this session we'll start with an introduction to the book itself, and then we'll move into a Q&A, a structured conversation rather between Juliana and Preti. Then Preti will do a reading from the book and then into an audience Q&A as well. So to start with, Juliana Mensah is a lecturer in English and creative writing here at York. She is the author of Casts from Cobwebs, which was longlisted for the Desmond Elliott Prize and won a Northbound Book Award. She's also a writer of theatre and short prose. She did her PhD and taught at Newcastle University, which is where today's speaker, Preti Taneja, is from. Preti Taneja is a writer, activist, and professor of world literature and creative writing at Newcastle University. She has widely published short stories, essays, literary criticism, and prose poetry. She won the Philip Leverhulme Prize in Languages and Literature. She is a BBC, HRC New Generation thinker, and an award-winning author, of course. Her debut novel, We That Are Young, won the Desmond Elliott Prize. This novel is a translation and a reimagination of King Lear set in contemporary India. And today she is here to talk about her second book, a non-fiction work, Aftermath. This work revisits a past event of violent terrorism. It interrogates the language of terror, trauma and grief, questioning how one rebuilds in the aftermath. It won the Gordon Byrne Prize, and we are delighted to hear about it today. So I'll hand over to you, Juliana.
Welcome, Preti.
Thank you.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us and to talk about this unique and extraordinary book. I wanted to give you an opportunity to introduce us to it. How would you describe this book, and how would you describe its origin story?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you all for coming. I know it's a hot day and a difficult subject, and often people who come to talks about this book have had experience of individual or state violence. So I really appreciate us coming together in community to think about some of the difficult things that the book raises. How would I describe it? I suppose in the book it describes itself as a lament. It's sort of like a lyrical way of reckoning with what happened on November 29th, 2019, when Usman Khan, who was incarcerated in HMP Whitemoor, one of the UK's high security men's prisons, for 9 years, when he was inside, he had taken part in an education programme called Learning Together, which was run by Cambridge University's law department. And Learning Together brought young people from Cambridge University to learn inside prisons alongside men who were incarcerated in different categories. It wasn't just category A, which is Whitemoor, category B, C, and D. Usman was released on a point of law. His sentence was transmuted from an indeterminate sentence to a determinate sentence as a matter of human rights. And he was released straight into the community, and 6 months later at an alumni event for Learning Together, which they had pulled a lot of strings and to get him to come to London that day because he was wearing a tag, he was under probation, he was under a lot of surveillance from MI5 in the Home Office. He attacked and killed 2 people who worked with Learning Together and injured 3 others. He was shot by police on London Bridge that day. I taught Usman creative writing inside HMP Whitemoor, and one of the young people who died that day, Jack Merritt, was my colleague and my friend. So the book is my way of trying to make sense of what I felt and knew and what I saw happening around me during that time.
Thank you very much for that introduction. You say really early on in the book that because of this event, you lost your faith in language, in words, in literature, and in their possibility. You write, these are your words, "Something has happened. I no longer believe in the potential of words to resist, to heal, or to sing the horizon." And in reading this, it really struck me that although you had that feeling, the very thing you turn to is the page. It's words. You start writing immediately and you're reading constantly. So although you say this rupture has happened and you've turned away from words and literature, actually you seem to turn towards it. And sorry, I'll continue. Another thing that struck me was that the section that begins the book is called Radical Doubt. And I wondered then that in the height of radical doubt, is there a radical hope that refuses to be extinguished? And I guess the question is, why write in that moment?
Well, I have to say that I've never really, it was an instinctive turning to writing to try to make sense of what happened. And there was this moment, and I'm sure everyone in Nottingham is feeling this right now. It's kind of awful and terrible to be talking about this event, because the book really thinks about trauma and these kinds of events as things that repeat. We don't know yet the facts around what happened in Nottingham, but there's a sort of collective grieving that starts almost immediately, where families, friends, students, people who live in the same city come together, press descends, police start their investigations, and there's a lot of emotions and feelings going on. It's a collective thing, but it's also a very singular and lonely and individual thing as well. So I started writing almost straight away because I've always done that to make sense of my own thoughts. I'm not a very verbalizing person. I've had to learn how to do that. My first instinct is basically to take my pencil and make some notes about what's happening in my brain. And so that's what I started to do as soon as this event sort of swept us all up in Cambridge, which is a very small place essentially, in its maelstrom of collective grief and complex trauma. And there was a sense that this event was, while it did kind of repeat patterns that we've seen before, it was very, very singular, because the person who carried out the attack knew the people he was attacking, because he had been released from prison where he had been incarcerated for something that he then went on to fulfill. He hadn't fulfilled that charge of terrorism when he was incarcerated at 19. So there were many things about this that felt very unusual. And I suppose I just didn't feel like I could find answers in any of the places I would usually have gone to, the poets, the philosophers, the places where one turns to make sense of how one's feeling. And yet I had to try to make some sense out of it, otherwise I wouldn't have survived it personally. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So as I've mentioned a little, the book is organised in 3 sections. So the first section is radical doubt, and then it's radicalising thought, and then radical hope. And in the first section, you do get this real sense of rupture, shattering has happened. The lines are broken, words are broken, there are dashes and spaces all over the page. And I wondered whether you could speak a little to that. And there's a particular example that I'm interested in as well. So to give an example to people who haven't read the book yet, you take the word atrocity and split it in 2. So it becomes atrocity, and it becomes a place, the location of violence. So could you say a little about what you're doing with language in breaking it up in those ways, but also creating new ways of thinking about violence and place, I suppose?
Yeah, so when things like this happen, people call them atrocities. And we're supposed to think that they're these unique and singular events that just come out of nowhere, and they're so shocking that we can call them atrocities. But for me, that word has always held that potential of place with this city that's inside the word. And because I'm bilingual, I grew up kind of looking at the English language as something that I broke down into parts to try to understand what the word meant, often trying to decode those words for myself, right? So I'm looking at this word and I'm thinking, in itself, it's telling us that this is not a singular event. It's an event that happens in a context, it happens in a place. It involves all of us. Cambridge University is only 1 hour from Whitemoor Prison. So our elite centre of learning is 1 hour from the worst place that we can imagine and build for our citizens within the national borders. There is no more worse place than Whitemoor Prison. I'm pretty sure of that. And inside the national borders. So we're not talking about when we outsource all of it to other countries and other parts of the world. So then I started to do my work as a writer and dig into what this atro part meant, and of course it means cruel. It comes from the etymology of the word cruel, and there it was, the cruel city, where Cambridge University and Whitemore and all of us live, and this traumatic event can happen.
You touched there on the idea that it involves all of us, and in reading the book I got a real sense that the reader is implicated, and you do that in several ways. There are various sections where you address the reader in second person, and I'll kind of ask you a question about that later. But I wonder, why was that something that was important for this project?
I think reading and writing binds us together in a unique way, and to do that piece of reading is to not look away from this harmful sort of atmosphere, this, let's call it the hostile environment, in which these things occur. And we all take part in that because we are citizens. The hostile environment's designed to make us surveil each other. It's designed to make us border guards and police and controllers. We have, as academics, we have a statutory duty to undertake prevent training, which, for those of you who do not know, it's the government's counter-terrorism program, where we're supposed to be very watchful as teachers and educators of our students to see if they're so that vulnerable to radicalisation. And there's a list of ways in which we're meant to do that, which, makes us police. So there's a culpability there about what we can take part in, how we vote, how we can protest those things, how we can protest or undermine the idea that our right to protest is being eroded, which is happening slowly and slowly and slowly, or actually on fast forward.
One of the other things that was with me as reading this book is that it was an event that prompted the writing of this book, and it was a very public event, in many ways a global event. It was covered all over the world, and then you started writing it, and it would be really interesting to hear about the process of writing it, but also quite early on in the writing process you knew that it was going to be public, it was going to be global. The first place it would be published would be North America, and I wondered whether you could speak to that as well and what that did for the writing process.
Yeah, so I had started writing these notes, and they were just for myself to make sense of all of the complexity of the grief around this attack that I could feel happening in Cambridge. And 2-3 years before, I had met an editor in North America who was starting a series called Undelivered Lectures with a small press based out of Oakland in California. And he had asked me, because he really liked my first book, if I wanted to contribute. It was a series where writers could write short essays of 15 to 30,000 words about any subject in any form, and they published them in these beautiful editions. And I kind of knew I wanted to write about prison, but I didn't know what I wanted to say, because I didn't want to do something which sort of took the stories of the guys and put them in a book where they were staying in prison and they would not be able to take part in that process, right, in the right way. Because ethics, politics and aesthetics are a really important combination of how I write and what kind of writer I want to be. Anyway, so January 2020 came, and I was travelling, which sounds insane because obviously we all know what happened in March. And then suddenly this email just dropped into my inbox saying, Preti, we've got the first book in this series ready, it's going to come out, do you want to have a look at it, and have you got anything you want to send us? And I just sent him my 6 pages of notes, and he sent me a contract the next day. So I started writing this book knowing that it was going to be a book in the world. And I have to say that really helped me, because it's very difficult to imagine what this book would have been if I hadn't always been aware that someone would be reading it, a public would be reading it. And I'm sure I would have just downloaded a huge amount more about what was happening behind the scenes in a sort of torrent, rather than trying to craft in a more controlled way and bring all of the skills I thought I wanted to bear on the actual writing. And it was great to have an editor who was supporting me and saying, maybe not this section, but definitely write more about this, and so on and so on, and helping me get that balance and distance. And the fact they were in America meant they were slightly removed from the heat of what happened.
That ties in really well, actually, with my next question, and it's about bringing to bear all of your skill and your craft in what you're doing in the book, and I suppose what that asks of the reader. So one of the things that I saw was that this book won the Gordon Burns Prize, the last one, and the prize was established to reward, and I quote, "literature which challenges perceived notions of genre and makes us think again about just what it is we are reading." And I felt like that really summed up my reading experience of Aftermath. There were several moments where it felt as though the book compelled me to stop and think about what was going on. One of the things that you've said is that, you know, this event really made you question what narrative can do, and this thing that we constantly say about the empathetic potential of reading and the redemptive qualities of writing, because you met Usman Khan in a prison and he was doing creative writing and then was still able to do this thing. So that in reading and writing, it doesn't necessarily make us good people or more empathetic. And I was conscious in reading this that it does feel very crafted. And it feels as though there are moments where you're holding the reader off at arm's length. So there's a point at which you tell the reader what a second person address does in writing. And you tell us that it puts the reader in the place of the character, but also it can be distancing. And then just a few paragraphs later, you do exactly that. Mm-hmm. And I wanted you to speak a little to that.
So I do see this book as a sort of craft manual in many ways for writing about trauma and writing about complex grief, and a term which I can't remember where I read now. A lot of the book is cited, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that, but there's a term, disenfranchised grief, where you're somehow complicit, you feel complicit by association to something that's happened, which carries a lot of violence and a lot of shame. So that's disenfranchised grief. You feel like you don't have the right to grieve in the same way as other people do who have a more direct and maybe simple relationship to what's happened. So, you know, and then not being a journalist and not being a lawyer or a criminologist, I had to think about how I was going to write this. And being the creative writing teacher, that was how I would do it, as a craft manual about how to do it, because I didn't know how to do it. And there were no maps. There was only bits of other people's thinking about their own traumas and generalizing in ways that poetry can do through expressive language and symbolism and lyricism and so on. So I was drawing on all of these different ways of doing to make something that could speak to this very unusual thing. And you started off by talking about the Gordon Burns Prize, and I think it's important to say about Gordon Burns. I mean, I was so delighted and moved to win that prize because Gordon Burns himself was a genre-breaking writer who wrote about incredibly difficult traumatic subjects. So one of his books is called Happy Like Murderers, and it's about the criminal mind. It's fiction, but it sort of draws on Fred and Rosemary West and very famous cases of Britain's sort of worst serial killers and so on that the Sun has built up and their national evils and so on. So to think about a publishing industry that's always respected Gordon's work and to take part in that legacy by winning the prize for this book sort of made me feel as if the book was doing something in a genealogy it had found its people in a really important way.
Talking about finding your people, Black American women feature prominently in this book. You turn to poets, activists, thinkers, writers, and I was wondering, I suppose, why you're drawn to them, what they mean to you, why you felt you wanted to call on them and on their works in this book.
So I often think that the conversation in America about race and social justice, about emancipation and about liberation is so far advanced compared to what we've been able to do and publish and talk about here. And I think that, you know, I went to school in the 90s, so Toni Morrison was the first woman of colour and only woman of colour writer that I encountered while at school. And I mean, when I think back now, I just think, thank goodness that happened to me, but also how is that possible? It's because there's a kind of curational system of publishing and cultural value, which meant she was the one writer that we ended up with on our syllabus. So we were able to understand transatlantic slavery in the American context and its harms through her amazing book. But there was no talk or discussion about that and Britain's own responsibilities and role in that process at all. And there was nothing about empire. I'm South Asian, I'm second generation, my parents are first generation, why on earth was I born in this country? All of those questions were not answered through the literature I was accessing at school. So Toni Morrison sort of opened the door to me to the conversations in American culture and poets and that, you know, social justice, the civil rights movements, and we can take a lot from how they have expressed the right to feel free and how they fought for that through language and through writing. And then we can ask ourselves, how can I learn from this and bring it to my own context? Because we do have a very specific set of things going on here which are very different from America for all of us from minoritized communities.
You touching on being kind of second generation, in the book you say that all second generation immigrants are experiments. And I found that there are lots of kind of points of contact, I think, for me personally within the book. And I found that an interesting proposition, I suppose. And one of the things that you mention is our ability to code switch and speak to different audiences. And I know that, like, some writers, Chinua Achebe, Aminata Forna, talk about speaking different languages within the English they use in their books. And I wondered, in writing this, were you ever aware of speaking to different audiences? Are you code switching at all in this text?
Am I code switching in the text? No, I don't think so, because I try to make my workings visible. I think an ethical way to do something like this is to show your workings. And so when I'm going to do something that belongs to a particular genre or a style or a form, I'm very obvious about it. And I'm saying, you know, I can do experimental writing and it is modernism, but you might read it as post-colonialism because you want me to stay in this world of, you know, black and brown, rather than elevating that experimentalism to what you would put Emma McBride in, or not to be specific, but to, you know, Hannah Burns, or the writers who claim that by a literary genealogy, which perhaps doesn't always include writers of colour, but it should, because we cannot not write experimentally. We're born here as kind of an experiment in how to make our own way with all the languages, with all the histories and things that we contain. And I think, you know, I am aware of writing for different audiences, but I think my first audience is the one who can just trust me and come with me. For those of you who speak Hindi or Urdu, there's a little linguistic pun in this book, which so much of this has to do with water. And of course, the Hindi word for water is pani, which is an anagram of the English word pain. And you wouldn't know that if you didn't know that, but there it is in the book, and it matters because the history of migration to this country has its roots in the building of dams and the water resources that were divided between India and Pakistan at partition, which has its roots in empire. So there's a lot you can do when you lean into the multiplicity of your languages, when you're trying to think through history, sociology, identity, and questions of how we are and how we can be.
And I think it's a really interesting point that you made at the beginning of the answer of that you may not consciously be trying to speak to different audiences with different elements of the book, but you will be read differently by different people.
Right.
And, so that is happening all the time.
Yeah, like some people think the book is evolving a form, but I'm not evolving a form. I mean, I wrote it, it's in the book, it's there. It's not evolving, it's not waiting for someone else to make it full and complete. So.
You mentioned earlier about the references in the book, and the book does, you know, it quotes poetry, there's literary analysis in it. You talk about you track your own origin story and Usman Khan's to that event. You use testimonies from the inquest. You kind of draw on all of these materials. And I wondered whether you could say a little more about I suppose, the complexity of the work that you're drawing on, the intertextuality, how you worked your way through what needed to be in the book.
So, so intertextuality is a really big part of how I write, and that's true in my first novel as well. Obviously, it's a version of King Lear, so at its heart, it is a book about intertextuality, and Lear is woven in with Mahabharata and Indian epics and Indian legal texts, and I also have a background in human rights reporting and human rights journalism. I used to be a reporter and editor for an NGO called Minority Rights Group International, which looks at religious, ethnic and linguistic minorities and the abuses that they are suffering in their own countries and conflicts. So for me to bring together the idea of how justice works into the poetic realm, into the realm of language, is really interesting. I find that very important. But the realities of writing a book like this in the circumstances I was writing in. So I started writing notes in December 2019, and then got the contract for the book in around January, February, and then everything shut in March. So I couldn't travel. I was in Newcastle. I didn't know anyone. I had just moved there. There was so many gaps in my ability to do research, especially around what had really happened and what the backstory to some of this was. And it wasn't till 2021, because the inquest was delayed because of COVID, that some of those gaps began to be filled. So one of the latest chapters was actually one of the early chapters that's in the book, and I think it's called Order, which references the court. But it's made up of fragments of lines from the inquest testimony and statements which are in the public domain. And I was reading those every day as the inquest was going on, because we couldn't go, right? We were in Tier 3. And so we couldn't go to London. We were just able to read the transcripts. And I did have to give a statement through the police about what happened, but I was not called to give evidence at the actual inquest. So to use that as a sort of way of constructing an idea of how to begin talking about why this person or how this person came to be, who he was and what he did, that had to be really rooted in the legal framework around him and what the law could tell us about those things that came out through the inquest in 2021. Yeah.
Would you read a little for us? Would you read a little for us?
Sure. So I'm going to read from the end of the book, and it's the section that's called Radical Hope, in which I do a bit of literary criticism about on novels, quite big novels, famous novels that have had lots of wide distribution, which talk about terrorism or prison. So, for example, there's a section on Don DeLillo, there's a section on Margaret Atwood's Hagseed, which is about Shakespeare's The Tempest, and it's set in a medium security prison. And also thinking about who the kind of incarcerated person is who gets to be a writer, or who already is a writer and is published, and what that can do. And I contrast those criticisms with my experience of actually teaching in Whitemoor as a way of seeing what literature does and what reality offers us. And it sort of coalesces towards the end of the book. It is early November 2019. Her writing seminar is now in its third year. The semester is almost done. She decides to set Ahmed Altan's Voyage Around My Cell, a chapter from his prison memoir, I Will Never See the World Again, in translation by Yasmin Jongar. Altan, the renowned Turkish writer and journalist, was arrested in 2016 on allegations of spreading subliminal messages announcing a military coup on television. He was charged with attempting to overthrow the national order and interfering with the work of the National Assembly and the government. He was given a life sentence in 2018 and subsequently tried on Turkey's terrorism charges, often used to convict high-profile people speaking against the state. He was finally released after 3 years. He is the category of prison writer people campaign for and listen to, the bona fide prisoner of the pen. She knows that so much of what he has to say in this piece might have been written by any one of the men she teaches. The descriptions of the dimensions of the cell, an invitation in to think about place as feeling, the question of hours locked down, an ability to think about time as a condition for reflection, the details of materiality, the plastic trestle table, the stackable chairs, a way to show how the objective correlative might work for difficult emotions, the things that become precious when those are all there are. The writing is mostly sparse as prison itself. The students might also have something to say about the moving descriptions of abundance and scarcity, Altan's observation that in prison, the lack of resources improves one's creativity. It's something she has thought about before in another discipline, how the monastic cell allows, even encourages the inner life to become consuming, how the writer craves solitude, yet is constantly open to distractions called research in this world. Writing seminars for beginners often start with a conversation about where ideas come from, the cells. Altan muses about the value of writing as an exercise during incarceration, the possibility of forgetting about everything for a while, about prison itself in dignity. Like all writers, I want both to forget and to be remembered, Altan says. Here is the bind of this strange art, and perhaps of the prison writer's condition in the strange room. Altan writes, I throw myself into unachievable dreams. Those are the dreams where I can alter time and space, where I can be in the century and the age of my choosing. It is a magical jungle filled with pleasure and games. There I take life and mould it into a very different shape every day. This is the kind of freedom she thinks that these writers get from those few hours spent writing together, with a group of young students who make the journey from the heart of the Atro city to what society considers its underworld, to work alongside them. And the same happens to them. Writers in her class of 2019 wrote their own voyage around my cell pieces. All of them considered, crafted, fresh interpretations on the theme. Some of the men argued with Altan. He got it wrong. The cell can be a solace, one said, from the rest of the prison, offering some kind of dignity when it is hard to hold on to inside oneself, even while a sentence lasts into years. Trying to capture the sense of something and release the joy of writing in the capture, in form. The prison courtyard here is quite sparse, she understands. In Altan's piece, which contains some whimsy, the kind rarely expressed by her students, courting birds drop pale flowers on the prison yard as they fly overhead, and the prisoners pick them up and take them inside. The next morning, the wardens come in and take them away, he writes. Flowers are forbidden in the prison. Reading those words now, she is reminded of the last time she saw Usman Khan. In the visitors' room at HMP Whitemoor in March 2018, at the end of course celebration for that year's writing seminars. It was a bright day at which all the graduating writers read their work to guests, some with pride, some nervously. One reminded the audience, his voice shaking, that the last time he had read in front of a crowd, he had been in court. Each student had been allowed to invite a guest. Friends, family members, university representatives, and a member of parliament mingled with the men. Characteristic of the prison's faith in the education programme, it was allowed that tulips could be brought in to decorate the tables of the meeting room. At the close of the day, everyone took a bunch and offered stems to each other. As we left, visitors reclaimed the prisoners' flowers and took them home with us.
It's interesting that you chose to read that because we had a conversation before this meeting, and I'd said that when I got to that bit, as well as it being incredibly evocative, one of the things that struck me was that throughout the book you refer to the men as incarcerated men. And in this moment, this last recollection of the last time you saw Usman Khan, you call them prisoners for I think the only time in the book. And I wondered why you made that choice.
I mean, I'm so astonished about the depth of the reading that you did of this, and I'm so grateful. It's something I hadn't realised myself, but I think you might be right. It is the only time that I, as the writer, referred to the people who are inside those places as prisoners. And it was two things, really. The first was, that is a sentence that just took me forever to get right, because as a writer, you have this kind of vanity that you want the words to land in a particular way. You want them to have resonance and emotion. You want there to be like a definite sense of what you're actually saying, while also kind of hiding what you're doing. And there were too many groups of people to try to make sense of that. It wouldn't have landed if that hadn't been the word. And then, of course, the word just made that split evident. And it was a moment where, even though the whole day had been about coming together, some of us leave and had the right to leave, and those who did not leave are still there. So, in the end, it kind of took on that function of reminding everyone what society uses, language that society uses to say these people are staying, these people are leaving. But of course, as abolitionists, we all know that not all violent people are in prison, and not all people in prison have been violent. So,
absolutely. I also wondered, and I'm not sure whether this is too bleak a reflection, but whether in some unconscious way it's a reverse gesture to the thing that I spoke of at the beginning. So if in Radical Doubt there was this kind of persistent element of radical hope that refused to be extinguished, if also in that moment of radical hope there is a reflection of how persistent these structures are and how much they control the way we think and the language that we use.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think there is another section in the book where I talk about what writing is, and I sort of think about it as sort of the longing to die and the desire to make revolution. And I think that's what you're saying, and the friction of those two things makes sparks, and in the fire you make something come out of that. You both want to just be, what, as Altan describes it, disappear and be made extremely visible. And so there's sort of entropy that's always pulling away at our creative acts, which we're at once writing against because we're hoping that our work will last. But also we have to be, in order to have that hope, we know we have to die. And I suppose I'm always cognizant of that, and that when I'm working, that's inevitable.
I could continue talking to you on and on and on, but I realise we should throw the questions out. But I have one final question, if I may. And I suppose it's just a question about, so this book is not just an intellectual labour, right? Emotional labour was involved in it. And I'm wondering about that, about what the aftermath of Aftermath has been, and if in writing the book, if you've managed to reclaim the potential for, in your quote, for words to resist, to heal, to see in the horizon.
That's such a great question. Yeah, so it's been 3 years since the actual event. It's coming up to 3.5, and I think it's, you know, a year or so since the book first came out in the UK. Can't believe that's only been a year. And, you know, it's absolutely incredible for us to have these conversations. I'm just always astonished to come and talk about this book and to meet people who have read it and to hear from people who have had experiences of violence themselves. And people do write to me all the time, and they share that, you know, someone they knew, or they got hurt by someone, and then someone they knew hurt someone in the same way, and they don't know how to deal with that, and it's a very complex thing, and then they watch that person go through this criminal justice system, and it's totally punitive and just despair. And you know, the statistics of like incarceration for minorities, especially men in this country, are horrendous for black and brown men. Just as the exclusion from school is, just as the stop and search is. So we can see these beats in the school to prison pipeline, which just make you feel devastated. But And that sometimes feels really heavy because it's only getting worse. But I think a book like this also shows from the responses that there is a really strong desire to have nuanced and complex conversations about the state of our country and how we are citizens in it together, and what our duties and of care are to ourselves and each other, to make the kinds of worlds where young men don't fall prey to radicalization of algorithms online, or consistent messages that they are worthless, that they have no origin stories, there's no dignity in their lives, there's no hope, and so something else will fill that gap very easily, whether or not you're coming at it from a religious or a fascist or whatever it is perspective. And I think that's helped a lot to pull me forward into what I think writing can actually do. And on the other hand, of all of that hope in the prize and the conversations that I have with readers on platforms and in private, there's been the kind of corresponding outrage from the media and whatever. But I guess, once you start to be on the receiving end of that, you must be doing something, or your work must be doing something that feels important.
That just leaves it for us to say thank you so much, Preti. You've been very generous with your responses and in your writings.
Thank you so much for your raising questions.